Have you ever had one of those moments where everything changes in an instant, where the life you knew just vanishes in the time it takes to cross a street? That moment when fate decides to flip your world upside down, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it? Emma Rodriguez stepped off the curb on Meeting Street, her laptop bag bouncing against her hip as she hurried toward the coffee shop where her client was waiting. At 26, she had finally built her freelance graphic design business to the point where she could afford her own apartment in Charleston's historic district, a modest studio that overlooked the harbor. The morning sun painted the antebellum buildings in golden light, and the familiar scent of jasmine and salt air filled her lungs as she navigated the familiar intersection she had crossed hundreds of times before. She was thinking about the logo redesign she was about to present when the sound of screaming tires cut through the morning quiet. Emma turned her head toward the noise, her brown eyes widening as she saw the sleek black Maserati barreling toward her, the driver's attention clearly focused on the phone pressed to his ear rather than the road ahead. Time seemed to slow as she realized what was about to happen. Her feet tried to carry her forward, toward safety, but physics and momentum had already claimed victory. The impact sent her flying 15 feet through the air, her laptop bag spinning away as her body hit the pavement with a sickening crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Pain exploded through her left leg as bone met asphalt, white-hot agony shooting up her spine and radiating through her entire body. She tried to move, tried to push herself up, but her leg wouldn't respond properly. Something was very wrong. Something was broken. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she lay there, staring up at the morning sky that had been so beautiful just moments before. The Maserati had come to a stop about 50 yards down the street, its pristine paint job barely scratched despite having just destroyed a human being. Emma watched through pain-hazed vision as the driver emerged, a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit who looked more annoyed than concerned as he surveyed the damage to his vehicle. Marco Salvatore had been having a bad morning even before he hit the pedestrian. His lieutenant had just informed him that their rivals were making moves on their territory down at the docks, and the conversation had required his full attention. The last thing he needed was some civilian getting in his way when he had more pressing matters to handle. He approached Emma with the same casual arrogance he brought to every situation, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the chaos, his green eyes cold and calculating as they assessed the scene. At 38, Marco had built his reputation on his ability to handle problems quickly and efficiently, and this was just another problem that needed to be managed. "You are going to be fine," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "My lawyer will handle everything. You just need to keep quiet about this, and we can work something out." Emma tried to focus on his words, but the pain in her leg was overwhelming, waves of agony washing over her every time she attempted to move. She could feel something warm and sticky spreading beneath her, and the rational part of her mind recognized that she was bleeding internally. This was not something that money could fix, no matter how much this stranger in his expensive suit seemed to think otherwise. "I need an ambulance," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the growing crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness the aftermath of the collision. Marco glanced around at the witnesses, his jaw tightening with irritation. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in rapid Italian to someone who was clearly accustomed to cleaning up his messes. Then he turned back to Emma, crouching down beside her with the kind of predatory grace that suggested he was far more dangerous than he initially appeared. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only she could hear. "You were not paying attention when you crossed the street. You stepped right in front of my car without looking. That is the story you are going to tell the police, and that is the story you are going to tell anyone else who asks. Do we understand each other?" Emma stared up at him, trying to process what he was saying through the fog of pain and shock. He was asking her to lie, to take responsibility for an accident that was clearly his fault. She had been in the crosswalk, had been following all the rules, while he had been driving recklessly with his attention on his phone conversation rather than the road. But looking into his cold green eyes, she realized that this was not a request. This was a threat from someone who was accustomed to having his demands met without question. Someone who had the kind of money and connections that could make problems disappear, including witnesses who might contradict his version of events. The sound of sirens finally filled the air, growing closer with each passing second. Marco straightened up, smoothing his suit jacket as if nothing had happened, transforming back into the picture of respectability and wealth. By the time the paramedics arrived, he had his phone out and was already coordinating with his legal team, speaking in the kind of authoritative tone that suggested he expected immediate action. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness as the EMTs worked on her, their voices urgent as they discovered the extent of her injuries. Compound fracture of the left femur, possible internal bleeding, signs of serious trauma that would require immediate surgery. She caught fragments of their conversation, medical terms that painted a picture of damage far more extensive than she had initially realized. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she saw Marco standing beside his barely damaged Maserati, speaking to a police officer who seemed far more interested in taking notes than in asking difficult questions. Money talks, she realized dimly, and she was just another obstacle that had gotten in its way. The ambulance ride passed in a blur of sirens and medical equipment, the paramedics working frantically to stabilize her condition before they reached the hospital. Emma found herself thinking about her father, about how worried he would be when he found out what had happened. James Rodriguez had always been protective of his only daughter, especially since her mother had died when Emma was just 11 years old. At Charleston Medical Center, the emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as the trauma team took over her care. Doctors barked orders while nurses prepared her for surgery, their faces grim as they assessed the damage. Emma caught glimpses of X-rays that showed her shattered bone, heard whispered conversations about complications and recovery times that stretched far into the future. Dr. Harrison Chun, the orthopedic surgeon who would be rebuilding her leg, explained the procedure in careful terms while she signed consent forms with a shaking hand. The surgery would take several hours, and there were no guarantees about how well she would walk afterward. Physical therapy would be extensive, and full recovery might take more than a year. As the anesthesia began to take hold, Emma's last conscious thought was about the man in the expensive suit who had threatened her while she lay bleeding on the pavement. Marco Salvatore had no idea who he had just destroyed, no idea that his reckless actions had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring down everything he had spent his life building. In the waiting room, Marco's lawyer was already working on damage control, offering settlement figures to Emma's emergency contacts and preparing liability waivers that would protect his client from any future claims. It was a routine they had perfected over the years, the systematic cleanup of problems before they could become threats to Marco's carefully constructed empire. But some problems, Marco would soon discover, were too big for money to solve. Some victims had connections that reached far beyond what expensive lawyers and intimidation tactics could handle. And sometimes, hitting the wrong person at the wrong time could trigger consequences that would destroy everything a man had worked his entire life to protect. As Emma disappeared into surgery, fighting for her mobility and her future, Marco drove home in his damaged Maserati, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his criminal career. The collision on Meeting Street had been just the beginning, the first domino in a sequence that would ultimately bring the full weight of federal justice crashing down on his head. In a few hours, when Emma woke up from surgery and reached for her phone to call her father for emotional support, Marco's comfortable world would begin its rapid and irreversible collapse. Emma surfaced from the fog of anesthesia with her mouth feeling like cotton and her left leg encased in what felt like concrete. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses checking on post-surgical patients. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across her hospital bed as she slowly oriented herself to her new reality. The surgery had taken 4 hours. Dr. Chun had inserted a titanium rod and multiple screws to hold her shattered femur together, explaining in careful terms that she would need months of physical therapy and might never walk quite the same way again. The words felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life rather than her own carefully planned future. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, needing to hear her father's voice more than she had since she was a child. James Rodriguez had raised her alone after her mother's death, and despite his demanding career, he had always been her anchor when the world felt too overwhelming to navigate. "Dad," she said when he answered on the first ring, her voice cracking with emotion she had been holding back since the accident. "Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Director James Rodriguez was in his office at FBI headquarters in Washington, but his daughter's tone made everything else disappear. He had developed an instinct over the years for when she truly needed him, and this was one of those moments. "I was hit by a car this morning," she managed to say before the tears started falling. "I'm in the hospital in Charleston. They had to do surgery on my leg, and I don't know if I'm going to be okay." The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat before her father's protective instincts roared to life with the force of a federal avalanche. "Are you safe right now? Who hit you? Do the doctors say you'll recover fully?" Emma found herself pouring out the entire story, from crossing the intersection to waking up in recovery, including details about the man in the expensive suit who had threatened her while she lay bleeding on the pavement. She described Marco's cold green eyes, his arrogant assumption that money could buy silence, his casual cruelty towards someone he had nearly killed. Director Rodriguez listened with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most effective federal law enforcement officials in the country. When Emma finished, his voice carried a deadly calm that his subordinates would have recognized as the prelude to systematic destruction. "Emma, I want you to listen carefully," he said. "I'm mobilizing a protection detail immediately. Do not speak to anyone about this accident except medical personnel until federal agents arrive. The man who hit you made a mistake that will cost him everything he has ever built." While Emma processed her father's response, Marco Salvatore was dealing with his own crisis 3 floors below in the hospital's main lobby. His lawyer had insisted on returning to check on the victim's condition, partly for legal strategy and partly to ensure that their intimidation tactics were having the desired effect. Marco had built his criminal empire through careful calculation and ruthless efficiency. He owned judges, had politicians in his pocket, and commanded respect through a combination of wealth and barely contained violence. But something about this morning's accident was gnawing at him, a sense that he had stumbled into something larger than a simple traffic incident. He took the elevator to Emma's floor with the kind of casual confidence that came from never facing consequences for his actions. The hospital staff barely glanced at him as he walked down the corridor, his expensive suit and authoritative demeanor marking him as someone who belonged in places where important decisions were made. Emma's room was private, a small mercy that allowed her to speak freely with her father without worrying about disturbing other patients. She was still processing his promise to mobilize federal resources when she heard footsteps approaching her door. Marco appeared in the doorway like a predator checking on wounded prey, his presence immediately filling the small room with tension. Emma felt her heart rate spike, the monitors betraying her fear as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone suggesting that her answer better aligned with his expectations for a quick and quiet resolution. Emma was about to respond when her father's voice came through the phone speaker, which she had forgotten was still active during their conversation. "Emma, are you still there?" Director Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Marco froze, his predatory smile disappearing as he processed what he was hearing. FBI Director James Rodriguez was not a name that anyone in organized crime could afford to ignore, and hearing it in this context sent ice water through his veins. "Yes, Dad, I'm here," Emma said, watching Marco's face transform from arrogant confidence to barely controlled panic. "Someone just walked into my room." "Emma, who is with you right now?" Director Rodriguez's voice had shifted into the commanding tone he used when coordinating federal operations. "The man who hit me," Emma replied, her eyes never leaving Marco's increasingly pale face. "He came back to the hospital." The silence that followed was deafening. Marco felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had not just hit some random pedestrian. He had nearly killed the daughter of the man who controlled the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the country. "Sir, you need to leave my daughter's room immediately," Director Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the phone with lethal authority. "And you need to understand that every action you take from this moment forward will be scrutinized by federal agents who are already being dispatched to that hospital." Marco backed toward the door, his mind racing through damage control scenarios while his organization's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He had faced federal investigations before, but never with this level of personal investment from the director himself. "This is not over," he said quietly, trying to project strength while his world collapsed around him. "You are absolutely right," Director Rodriguez replied from 800 miles away. "This is just beginning." After Marco left, Emma sat in her hospital bed processing the reality that her accident had just triggered a federal investigation. She had seen her father's protective instincts before, but never at this scale, never with the full weight of institutional power behind them. Within 2 hours, discreet federal agents had taken positions throughout the hospital, and Emma's room had become an unofficial federal crime scene. Director Rodriguez arrived on the next flight from Washington, bringing with him a team of investigators who specialized in organized crime prosecution. Marco, meanwhile, was discovering that his network of corrupt officials and intimidated witnesses was useless against federal scrutiny. His lawyer was fielding calls from contacts who suddenly wanted nothing to do with the situation, and his own organization was questioning whether their boss had finally made a mistake too big to survive. The accident on Meeting Street had been random, a moment of carelessness that could have happened to anyone. But hitting the wrong person at the wrong time had transformed Marco's comfortable criminal empire into a target for the kind of systematic federal investigation that had destroyed better protected organizations than his. Emma drifted off to sleep that night knowing that her father was personally overseeing her protection, while Marco lay awake realizing that his criminal career might have ended the moment his Maserati collided with a young woman who happened to be the most dangerous person in America to hit with a car. The phone call had changed everything, transforming a local traffic incident into a federal case that would ultimately expose decades of criminal activity. And neither Emma nor Marco fully understood, yet that this was only the beginning of a story that would reach far deeper into both their lives than either could imagine. Director James Rodriguez had built his career on the principle that federal investigations were most effective when they were thorough, methodical, and absolutely relentless. But as he sat in the makeshift command center that had been established in Charleston Medical Center's administrative wing, he found himself fighting emotions that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with being a father whose child had been nearly killed. Special Agent Sarah Chun, his most trusted investigator, spread files across the conference table with the kind of systematic precision that had made her legendary within the Bureau. At 42, she had overseen more organized crime takedowns than any other agent in her division, and Director Rodriguez had personally requested her for this case, because he knew that Marco Salvatore was about to face the most comprehensive federal investigation of his life. "We have preliminary background on your daughter's attacker," Agent Chin said, opening a thick file that contained 15 years of surveillance reports, financial records, and criminal intelligence. Marco Salvatore, 38, suspected head of the Salvatore crime family operating primarily out of Charleston and surrounding coastal areas. His organization generates revenue through money laundering, extortion, illegal gambling, and suspected involvement in several unsolved homicides. Director Rodriguez studied the photographs of Marco with the cold analytical focus that had made him one of the most feared federal prosecutors before his promotion to bureau leadership. But beneath his professional demeanor, a father's rage was building with each detail of the man who had nearly killed his daughter and then threatened her while she lay broken and bleeding. "Run a complete analysis on all cases involving the Salvatore organization," he instructed. "I want to know every crime, every victim, every connection they have had with federal law enforcement over the past 2 decades. This man made the mistake of targeting my family, and I intend to ensure that he faces consequences for every criminal act he has ever committed." Agent Chin nodded and began coordinating with the computer analysis team that had been flown in specifically for this investigation. Within hours, FBI databases were being systematically searched for any mention of the Salvatore organization, their associates, or their suspected criminal activities. It was late that evening when Agent Chun returned to the command center with a file that would change everything. "Director Rodriguez," she said quietly, "we found something in the database that you need to see immediately." She opened a cold case file that was 15 years old, its pages yellowed with age, but its contents still capable of stopping a man's heart. FBI agent Maria Elena Rodriguez, killed in apparent robbery while off duty in Charleston, South Carolina. Investigation inconclusive. Case remains open. Director Rodriguez stared at his dead wife's photograph, remembering the woman who had been his partner in both law enforcement and life until a random act of violence had stolen her away when Emma was just 11 years old. Maria had been visiting Charleston for a federal conference when she was killed, and despite extensive investigation, her murder had never been solved. The connection might be coincidental, Agent Chen said carefully, but the location and timing suggest we should examine this more closely. Run a complete cross-reference analysis, Director Rodriguez said, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. If there is any connection between my wife's death and the Salvatore organization, I want every piece of evidence available. The computer analysis took 3 hours, but when it was complete, the results painted a picture that transformed personal tragedy into a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. Maria Rodriguez had not been killed in a random robbery. She had been assassinated because her federal investigation was getting too close to the Salvatore organization's money laundering operations. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Maria's investigation file showed that she had been tracking financial irregularities that led directly to businesses owned by the Salvatore family. Her notes indicated that she was planning to recommend federal prosecution for racketeering charges that would have dismantled their entire criminal enterprise. 3 days before she was scheduled to present her findings to federal prosecutors, Maria Rodriguez was found dead in a Charleston alley, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But the computer analysis revealed patterns that investigators had missed 15 years ago. The timing, the location, the systematic destruction of her investigation files all pointed to a professional assassination designed to look like random violence. Director Rodriguez sat in the empty command center at 3 in the morning, staring at evidence that his wife had been murdered by the same criminal organization whose leader had nearly killed his daughter. The coincidence was impossible, which meant it was not a coincidence at all. Emma's accident had brought him face to face with the people who had destroyed his family 15 years ago. Agent Chen found him there when she arrived the next morning, surrounded by case files and computer printouts that told the story of a conspiracy that had successfully hidden itself for more than a decade. "Sir," she said gently, "we have enough evidence to begin federal prosecution under RICO statutes. The Salvatore organization's financial records show a pattern of criminal activity that stretches back 20 years. We can destroy them legally and systematically." Director Rodriguez looked up from his wife's case file, his eyes carrying the kind of cold determination that had made him legendary within federal law enforcement. "Do it," he said simply. "Use every resource available to the Bureau. I want this organization dismantled completely." As Agent Chen began coordinating the massive federal operation that would bring down the Salvatore crime family, Director Rodriguez walked to his daughter's hospital room to share news that would change her understanding of her own history forever. Emma was sitting up in bed, her leg elevated and surrounded by the kind of medical equipment that suggested a long road to recovery ahead. She looked fragile in her hospital gown, but her father could see the strength in her eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Emma," he said, sitting down beside her bed, "there is something about your accident that you need to know. Something about your mother's death that I should have told you years ago." He explained everything. The investigation, the computer analysis, the evidence that Maria Rodriguez had been assassinated to protect the same criminal organization that had nearly killed Emma. He watched his daughter's face as she processed the revelation that her mother's death had not been random violence, but calculated murder. "They killed her because she was going to expose them," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a rage that her father recognized from looking in mirrors after particularly difficult cases. "Yes," Director Rodriguez replied. "And now they have made the mistake of targeting you. The man who hit you with his car has no idea that he has just triggered a federal investigation that will destroy everything he has built." Emma stared out the hospital window at the Charleston skyline, thinking about her mother's unfinished investigation and the justice that had been denied for 15 years. The pain in her leg seemed insignificant compared to the realization that her family had been targeted twice by the same criminal organization. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we finish what your mother started," Director Rodriguez said. "We use every resource of the federal government to ensure that Marco Salvatore and everyone in his organization face consequences for their crimes." All of their crimes, including your mother's murder. That afternoon, while Emma processed the truth about her family's history with the Salvatore organization, Marco was discovering that his criminal empire was under assault from forces he had never imagined. Federal agents were systematically examining every aspect of his business operations, and his network of corrupt officials was suddenly unavailable when he needed them most. His lieutenant Vincent brought news that several of their financial accounts had been frozen by federal order, and that businesses they had controlled for years were being investigated for money laundering and racketeering. The careful structure that had protected their operations for decades was crumbling under focused federal scrutiny. "Boss," Vincent said nervously, "maybe we should consider reaching out to our contacts in the Justice Department. This investigation is bigger than anything we have faced before." Marco stared out his office window at Charleston Harbor, realizing that hitting Emma Rodriguez had been more than just a traffic accident. It had been the beginning of the end of everything he had worked his entire life to build. The FBI director's daughter was not just a victim seeking justice for her injuries. She was the daughter of a federal agent who had been murdered to protect his organization's secrets. The investigation was just beginning, but Marco could already feel the walls closing in around him. Federal resources were being mobilized with the kind of personal investment that made compromise or corruption impossible. He had made an enemy of the one man in America who had both the power and the motivation to destroy him completely. As Emma fell asleep that night, she was thinking about her mother's unfinished work and the justice that was finally within reach. And as Marco lay awake planning desperate strategies for survival, he was beginning to understand that some mistakes were too big for money or violence to fix. The investigation was deepening with each passing hour, and both Emma and Marco were about to discover that the collision on Meeting Street had been just the beginning of a story that would ultimately expose 15 years of hidden truth and deliver the justice that Maria Rodriguez had died trying to achieve. The federal task force assembled in Charleston represented the kind of institutional power that most criminals only encountered in their nightmares. Director Rodriguez had mobilized resources from 6 different agencies, creating a coordinated investigation that would examine every aspect of the Salvatore organization's operations with the systematic thoroughness that had destroyed larger criminal enterprises than Marco's. Special Agent Sarah Chun stood before a room filled with federal prosecutors, financial crime specialists, organized crime investigators, and surveillance experts who had been flown in from across the country specifically for this operation. The whiteboard behind her was covered with photographs, financial charts, and organizational diagrams that painted a comprehensive picture of Marco's criminal empire. The Salvatore organization has operated in Charleston and surrounding areas for approximately 20 years, Agent Chun explained to the assembled team. Their revenue streams include money laundering through legitimate businesses, extortion of local enterprises, illegal gambling operations, and suspected involvement in multiple homicides, including the assassination of FBI agent Maria Rodriguez 15 years ago. Federal prosecutor David Hayes, who had been personally selected by the Attorney General for this case, reviewed the evidence files with the kind of focused intensity that had made him legendary for his RICO prosecutions. At Fort Yates, he had dismantled more organized crime families than any prosecutor in the country, and he understood that this case represented both professional opportunity and personal justice for Director Rodriguez. "We have sufficient evidence to pursue comprehensive RICO charges," Prosecutor Hayes announced. "Financial records show a pattern of criminal enterprise stretching back 2 decades. We can prove money laundering, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic corruption of local officials. This organization will be completely dismantled through legitimate federal prosecution." While the task force coordinated their systematic attack on his empire, Marco Salvatore was discovering that 15 years of careful corruption and intimidation meant nothing when facing focused federal attention. His network of bought judges and compromised officials was suddenly unavailable, and his usual channels of information had gone completely silent. Vincent Torino, his most trusted lieutenant, brought increasingly desperate reports about the scope of the federal investigation. Multiple surveillance teams were watching their known associates. Financial accounts were being systematically frozen, and businesses that had generated revenue for years were being shut down by regulatory agencies that had never shown interest before. "Boss," Vincent said, pacing nervously in Marco's office. They have surveillance on everyone. Our usual contacts and local law enforcement are not returning calls, and our lawyer says he cannot help us with federal charges at this level. Marco stared out his office window at Charleston Harbor, realizing that his carefully constructed criminal empire was collapsing faster than he had thought possible. He had faced federal investigations before, but never with this kind of personal investment from the director himself. Emma Rodriguez was not just another victim to be intimidated or bought off. She was the daughter of the man who controlled federal law enforcement, and her pain had triggered an institutional response that would not be satisfied with anything less than complete destruction. Back at Charleston Medical Center, Emma was providing detailed testimony to federal investigators while her physical therapy progressed slowly and painfully. The titanium rod in her leg was healing properly, but Dr. Chen had warned her that full recovery would take months, and she might never walk quite the same way again. Agent Lisa Torres, who specialized in victim testimony for organized crime cases, guided Emma through the process of documenting every detail of her encounter with Marco. His threats while she lay bleeding, his casual assumption that money could buy silence, his arrogant belief that wealth and connections made him untouchable. He told me that I should say I stepped in front of his car without looking, Emma explained, her voice steady despite the anger that was building as she relived the experience. He said that was the story I would tell police and anyone else who asked. He was not asking me to lie. He was telling me what I was going to do. Agent Torres documented Emma's testimony with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make it admissible in federal court. Every word Marco had spoken, every threat he had made, every attempt at intimidation was being preserved as evidence of criminal behavior that would add years to his eventual sentence. Your testimony establishes a pattern of witness intimidation that supports our broader RICO case, Agent Torres explained. Combined with the evidence about your mother's murder, we can prove that this organization has been systematically eliminating threats for decades. 3 days after the task force assembled, federal raids began across 4 states simultaneously. Marco's money laundering operations in Savannah were shut down by Treasury agents. His gambling operations in Myrtle Beach were raided by local police coordinating with federal authorities, and his extortion network in Charleston was dismantled through systematic arrests of his street-level operatives. The raids were coordinated with military precision, striking every aspect of Marco's criminal enterprise within a 6-hour window that gave his organization no time to destroy evidence or warn associates. Federal agents seized financial records, computer systems, communication devices, and physical evidence that documented 20 years of criminal activity. Marco watched the destruction of his empire through news coverage that seemed surreal in its completeness. Local television stations reported on the largest federal organized crime investigation in South Carolina history, showing footage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from businesses he had controlled for years. His phone rang constantly with reports from associates who were being arrested, businesses that were being shut down, and financial accounts that were being frozen by federal order. The systematic nature of the investigation was overwhelming, designed to destroy not just his current operations, but any possibility of rebuilding his criminal empire. Vincent burst into Marco's office with news that several of their longest-serving associates had already begun cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. The loyalty that had held the organization together for decades was crumbling under the pressure of facing life sentences for RICO violations. They are offering deals to anyone who provides information about our operations, Vincent reported. Michael Costello just turned himself into federal agents and is cooperating with their investigation. If he talks, they will know everything about our financial operations for the past 10 years. Marco realized that his organization's survival had depended on a delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and mutual benefit that was being systematically destroyed by federal prosecutors who understood exactly how to break criminal enterprises apart from the inside. The men who had followed him for years were now saving themselves by betraying everything they had built together. Federal prosecutor Hayes was methodically building a case that would ensure life sentences for Marco and his top associates, while offering meaningful plea agreements to lower-level criminals who could provide testimony about the organization's structure and operations. It was a strategy that had proven effective in dozens of organized crime prosecutions, and Marco's empire was collapsing exactly as Hayes had predicted. Emma's physical therapy sessions became a daily reminder of her progress toward recovery and justice. Each step she managed to take without assistance was not just physical healing, but proof that Marco's attempt to destroy her life had failed completely. The man who had threatened her, while she lay bleeding, was now facing the complete destruction of everything he had worked his entire life to build. Dr. Chun was optimistic about her long-term recovery, though he warned that she would need several more months of intensive physical therapy before returning to normal activities. The titanium rod was integrating well with her bone structure, and her determination to heal was accelerating the process beyond what medical professionals had initially expected. "Your progress has been remarkable," Dr. Chin told her during a follow-up examination. "Most patients with this type of injury would still be using assistive devices, but your commitment to physical therapy is producing exceptional results." Emma understood that her rapid recovery was motivated by more than just personal healing. She wanted to be strong enough to testify in federal court when Marco and his associates faced trial. She wanted to look him in the eye and speak about what he had done to her family, both 15 years ago when he had her mother killed and 3 weeks ago when he had nearly killed her. Director Rodriguez visited his daughter every evening after coordinating the massive federal investigation that was systematically destroying the Salvatore organization. He brought updates about arrests, asset seizures, and cooperation agreements that painted a picture of criminal empire in complete collapse. Marco's attempts to flee the country were thwarted by federal surveillance that had anticipated his desperation. When he attempted to board a private jet to a non-extradition country, federal agents were waiting at the airport with arrest warrants that would keep him in federal custody until trial. The investigation had moved with the kind of focused efficiency that Director Rodriguez brought to cases where federal agents had been targeted. Marco's empire was not just being dismantled, but systematically destroyed in a way that would prevent any possibility of rebuilding or retaliation. As Emma fell asleep that night, she was thinking about her mother's unfinished investigation and the justice that was finally within reach. The federal machinery that Maria Rodriguez had served faithfully was now completing the work that had cost her life 15 years ago. Marco spent his first night in federal custody realizing that hitting Emma Rodriguez with his car had been the beginning of the end of everything he had ever built. The collision on Meeting Street had triggered consequences that would ultimately expose every crime his organization had committed and ensure that he would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The Charleston Executive Airport was shrouded in early morning fog when Marco Salvatore arrived with 2 suitcases containing everything he could carry from a criminal empire that had taken 20 years to build. The private jet waiting on the tarmac represented his last hope of escaping federal prosecution, a final desperate gambit to reach a non-extradition country before the walls of justice closed around him completely. Vincent had arranged the flight through contacts in the Cayman Islands, men who specialized in helping wealthy criminals disappear when their carefully constructed worlds collapsed. The pilot was already running through pre-flight procedures when Marco's limousine pulled up to the hangar, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like searchlights hunting for prey. Marco stepped out of the vehicle with the kind of forced confidence that had carried him through decades of criminal activity. But beneath his expensive suit and polished exterior, he was a man whose world had been systematically destroyed by forces beyond his control. The federal investigation had moved with surgical precision, dismantling every aspect of his organization while closing off every avenue of escape. He had made it halfway to the waiting aircraft when the fog around the hangar suddenly blazed with floodlights, revealing federal agents positioned with military precision throughout the airport facility. Special Agent Sarah Chun emerged from behind the jet with arrest warrant in hand, her voice carrying across the tarmac with the authority of institutional justice. "Marco Salvatore, you are under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and the assassination of federal agent Maria Rodriguez," Agent Chin announced. "You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you will want to hear what evidence we have collected over the past month." Marco's knees nearly buckled as the full scope of the federal case became clear. They had not just investigated his recent criminal activities, but had connected him to Maria Rodriguez's murder 15 years ago. the killing that had launched his organization's rise to power in Charleston's criminal underworld. Federal agents searched his luggage systematically, finding financial documents, false identification papers, and communication devices that would provide additional evidence for prosecution. The careful escape plan that should have carried him to safety had become another piece of evidence proving his guilt and consciousness of criminal activity. Agent Chen opened a thick briefcase containing financial records, recorded conversations, and witness statements that painted a comprehensive picture of Marco's criminal enterprise. "We have documented evidence of your organization's activities for the past 20 years, she explained as handcuffs were placed around his wrists. Financial records showing systematic money laundering through 17 legitimate businesses. Recorded conversations discussing extortion payments from local merchants. Witness testimony from former associates detailing your personal involvement in multiple homicides." But the evidence that made Marco's blood run cold was the forensic analysis that connected ballistics from Maria Rodriguez's murder to weapons seized during the federal raids. The killing that his organization had successfully concealed for 15 years had been exposed through advanced technology and investigative techniques that did not exist when the crime was originally committed. "The bullet that killed Agent Rodriguez came from a weapon registered to your organization," Agent Chen continued. "We have testimony from former associates confirming that you personally ordered her assassination when her investigation threatened your money laundering operations. This case will seek the death penalty under federal law." As Marco was loaded into a federal transport vehicle, his mind raced through the cascade of betrayals and evidence that had brought him to this moment. The collision with Emma Rodriguez had not been just a traffic accident, but the beginning of a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. Director Rodriguez was waiting at the federal courthouse when Marco's transport arrived, surrounded by security personnel and federal marshals who would ensure that the man who had destroyed his family faced justice without possibility of escape or retaliation. The sight of Marco in federal custody represented a moment of vindication that had been decades in the making. Emma had insisted on being present for Marco's first court appearance, despite her father's concerns about her physical recovery and the emotional stress of confronting the man who had nearly killed her. She arrived at the courthouse using a walking cane. Her determination to see justice served overriding any concerns about her ongoing rehabilitation. The federal courthouse in Charleston had been transformed into a fortress for Marco's arraignment, with security measures typically reserved for international terrorists or heads of state. Federal prosecutors were taking no chances with a case that represented both personal justice for the FBI director and professional validation of federal law enforcement's ability to dismantle organized crime. Marco appeared before federal judge Patricia Williams wearing standard federal custody clothing instead of the expensive suits that had marked his status in Charleston's criminal underworld. The man who had threatened Emma while she lay bleeding in the street now stood shackled and powerless before the institutional authority he had spent his career trying to circumvent. Federal prosecutor Hayes presented an indictment that encompassed 20 years of criminal activity, from Marco's early involvement in street-level extortion to his eventual rise as head of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had corrupted local officials and terrorized legitimate businesses throughout the region. The defendant stands accused of operating a criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue while systematically eliminating any threats to their operations, Prosecutor Hayes announced. This includes the assassination of FBI agent Maria Rodriguez, who was killed because her investigation was exposing their money laundering activities. Emma watched from the gallery as Marco heard the charges against him, studying his face for any sign of remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused her family. But the man who had been so arrogant and threatening in her hospital room now seemed diminished and frightened, a petty criminal facing consequences he had never imagined possible. During a recess in the proceedings, federal marshals allowed Emma a brief opportunity to speak directly to Marco under carefully controlled circumstances. She approached his holding area with her walking cane, her physical recovery serving as visible proof that his attempt to destroy her life had failed completely. "You killed my mother 15 years ago because she was going to expose your crimes," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying the strength that had helped her survive both physical trauma and emotional devastation. And then you tried to kill me to cover up your recklessness. But you made the mistake of targeting a family that would never stop fighting for justice. Marco looked up at her with the hollow eyes of a man whose world had been completely destroyed. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said, his voice barely audible. The accident was not planned. But threatening me while I was bleeding was planned, Emma replied. Trying to intimidate me into lying for you was planned. And murdering my mother was definitely planned. You spent your entire criminal career making calculated decisions that destroyed innocent lives. Now you will face calculated consequences that will destroy yours. The conversation was brief, but provided Emma with the closure she needed to begin healing emotionally as well as physically. Seeing Marco in federal custody, powerless and facing life imprisonment, confirmed that justice was finally being served for crimes that had shaped her family's tragedy for 15 years. Judge Williams set bail at $50 million, effectively ensuring that Marco would remain in federal custody until trial. His organization's assets had been frozen or seized through federal forfeiture proceedings, making it impossible for him to raise the funds necessary for release. Over the following weeks, federal prosecutors systematically dismantled what remained of the Salvatore criminal enterprise through a series of plea agreements and cooperation deals that ensured comprehensive justice for decades of criminal activity. Associates who had remained loyal during the early stages of the investigation began providing testimony when faced with life sentences under RICO statutes. Vincent Torino, Marco's most trusted lieutenant, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence that would allow him to see freedom again before he died. His testimony provided details about the organization's structure, financial operations, and criminal activities that filled gaps in the federal investigation. The money laundering operation was more sophisticated than we initially realized, Vincent told federal investigators during recorded sessions that would be used in court. We had legitimate businesses in 4 states, with accounting systems designed to hide the source of criminal revenue. Marco personally approved every major financial decision and was involved in planning all violent activities. Vincent's cooperation led to additional arrests of corrupt local officials who had protected the Salvatore organization for years, expanding the federal case to include public corruption charges that would reform Charleston's political landscape. The systematic cleanup would ensure that criminal organizations could not easily re-establish themselves in the region. Emma's physical therapy progressed steadily as the federal case against Marco developed, her determination to testify in court motivating rapid improvement in her mobility and strength. Dr. Chun was amazed by her recovery rate, attributing her success to the psychological healing that came from seeing justice served for her family's suffering. The titanium rod in her leg was integrating perfectly with her bone structure, and her physical therapy sessions were producing results that exceeded medical expectations. She was walking without assistance for increasing distances, and her doctors were optimistic that she would achieve nearly complete recovery of her mobility. Your commitment to healing has been extraordinary, Dr. Chin told her during a follow-up appointment. Most patients with this type of injury would still be using assistive devices regularly, but you are approaching full recovery faster than I thought possible. Emma understood that her rapid healing was motivated by her determination to be strong enough to face Marco in federal court and speak about what he had done to her family. She wanted to stand without assistance when she testified about his crimes, presenting herself as a survivor rather than a victim. Federal prosecutors were building a case that would seek the death penalty for Marco's role in Maria Rodriguez's assassination while ensuring life sentences for his associates who had participated in the systematic criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming, documented through financial records, recorded conversations, and witness testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of organized criminal activity. Marco's attempts to negotiate plea agreements were rejected by federal prosecutors who understood that this case represented more than just criminal justice but personal vindication for Director Rodriguez and his family. There would be no deals or compromises for the man who had murdered a federal agent and then tried to kill her daughter. As Emma prepared for the trial that would finally deliver justice for her mother's death and her own suffering, she reflected on the strange sequence of events that had brought her family face to face with the truth about their shared tragedy. A random traffic accident had triggered a federal investigation that exposed 15 years of hidden criminal activity and delivered the justice that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The collision on Meeting Street had been the beginning of Marco's end, but it had also been the beginning of Emma's transformation from victim to survivor to someone strong enough to face the man who had tried to destroy her family and emerge victorious from the confrontation that would define the rest of her life. 6 months after the collision that had changed everything, Emma Rodriguez walked through the same Charleston intersection where her life had been shattered and rebuilt, her steps confident and sure on legs that doctors had once worried might never fully heal. The morning sun painted the historic buildings in the same golden light that had witnessed her accident, but the woman crossing Meeting Street was fundamentally different from the victim who had been broken there. The federal courthouse behind her still buzzed with media coverage for Marco Salvatore's sentencing hearing, where Judge Patricia Williams had delivered a life sentence without possibility of parole for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and the assassination of FBI agent Maria Rodriguez. The gavel that sealed Marco's fate had also closed a chapter of pain that had haunted Emma's family for 15 years. Emma paused at the exact spot where Marco's Maserati had struck her, remembering the moment when her world had exploded into pain and terror. But standing there now, she felt only a deep sense of completion, the knowledge that justice had been served not just for her own suffering, but for her mother's murder and all the other victims of Marco's criminal enterprise. The trial had lasted 3 months, with federal prosecutors presenting evidence so comprehensive that Marco's defense team had eventually advised him to accept a plea agreement that was rejected by prosecutors seeking maximum penalties. Emma had testified for 2 full days, her voice strong and unwavering as she described both the accident that had nearly killed her and the threats Marco had made while she lay bleeding on the pavement. Federal prosecutor Hayes had called her testimony the most compelling victim impact statement he had ever heard, a personal account that transformed abstract charges into human suffering that demanded justice. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, their decision reflecting both the overwhelming evidence and the emotional impact of Emma's courage in confronting her attacker. Marco's organization had been completely dismantled through the systematic prosecution of his associates, with Vincent Torino receiving a reduced sentence of 25 years in exchange for testimony that exposed every aspect of their criminal operations. The corruption network that had protected the Salvatore enterprise for decades was destroyed through additional prosecutions of local officials who had taken bribes and ignored evidence of criminal activity. Charleston's criminal underworld would never recover from the federal investigation that had been triggered by Emma's accident. The systematic prosecution had created a climate where organized crime could not easily reestablish itself, and federal monitoring would continue for years to prevent any resurgence of the activities that had terrorized the community for so long. Director James Rodriguez had announced his retirement from the FBI immediately after Marco's sentencing, his 30-year career culminating in the investigation that had delivered justice for his wife's murder and protected his daughter from further harm. The case had become legendary within federal law enforcement, a demonstration of how personal motivation and institutional resources could combine to achieve comprehensive justice. The retirement ceremony at FBI headquarters had been attended by agents from across the country who understood that Director Rodriguez had completed not just a career but a mission that had defined his life since Maria's death. His final case had been his most important, delivering the justice that had seemed impossible for 15 years. Emma had used the settlement money from Marco's seized criminal assets to establish the Maria Rodriguez Foundation, a victim advocacy organization that provided support and resources for families affected by organized crime. The foundation operated from a Charleston office that overlooked the harbor, serving as both memorial to her mother's legacy and practical assistance for people whose lives had been shattered by criminal violence. The foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for children whose parents had been killed while serving in law enforcement, ensuring that Maria Rodriguez's sacrifice would be honored through educational opportunities for other families who had faced similar tragedies. Emma had personally reviewed every application, understanding the unique challenges faced by children growing up without parents who had died protecting their communities. Dr. Harrison Chun continued to marvel at Emma's complete recovery, her leg functioning so well that she had returned to regular exercise and outdoor activities that would have seemed impossible during her darkest moments in the hospital. The titanium rod had integrated perfectly with her bone structure, and her commitment to physical therapy had produced results that exceeded every medical expectation. Your recovery has been the most remarkable I have seen in 20 years of orthopedic surgery, Dr. Chin told her during her final follow-up appointment. You have not just healed from serious trauma, but emerged stronger than you were before the accident. Your determination to overcome both physical and emotional challenges has been inspiring to everyone involved in your care. Emma's emotional healing had progressed alongside her physical recovery, aided by therapy sessions that helped her process both the recent trauma and the childhood grief she had carried since her mother's death. Understanding the truth about Maria's assassination had been painful, but ultimately liberating, replacing years of unanswered questions with knowledge that allowed genuine healing to begin. She had also found unexpected love with Special Agent Michael Torres, who had been part of the investigation team that brought down Marco's organization. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on shared understanding of justice and mutual respect for each other's strength in facing difficult challenges. Michael had been present for Emma's testimony during Marco's trial, watching with admiration as she faced her attacker with courage and dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. Their first conversation about something other than the case had been about her foundation work, and he had been moved by her commitment to helping other victims find the strength to seek justice. Have you ever thought about what you might have done differently if you could go back to that morning 6 months ago? Michael asked during one of their evening walks through Charleston's historic district. Emma considered the question as they paused beside the fountain in Washington Square Park, the same park where she had played as a child when her family had visited Charleston for her mother's federal conferences. I would not change anything, she said finally. That accident brought my family the truth we needed and the justice we deserved. It also showed me that I am stronger than I ever imagined possible. The memorial service for FBI agent Maria Rodriguez was held on the 15th anniversary of her death, with full federal honors that had been impossible when the circumstances of her murder were unknown. The FBI honor guard presented Emma with the flag that had draped her mother's ceremonial casket, and Director Rodriguez delivered a eulogy that celebrated both Maria's service and the justice that had finally been achieved. Maria Rodriguez died protecting the principles that define federal law enforcement, Director Rodriguez said to the assembled agents and family members. Her investigation was silenced by criminals who believed that violence could defeat justice. But her daughter's courage has proven that truth cannot be buried forever. The case that began with Maria's work 15 years ago has ended with the complete destruction of the criminal organization that killed her. Emma spoke at the memorial service about her mother's legacy and the foundation that would continue Maria's work through supporting other families affected by criminal violence. Standing at the podium where federal officials honored fallen agents, she felt the presence of the mother she had lost and the strength that had been passed down through generations of women who refused to be defeated by those who chose violence over justice. My mother dedicated her life to protecting innocent people from criminals who believed themselves above the law, Emma said to the gathering. Her death was not the end of her mission, but the beginning of a legacy that will continue through everyone who chooses justice over silence, courage over fear, and hope over despair. The Charleston Police Department dedicated a memorial plaque at the intersection of Meeting and Broad Streets, marking the location where Emma's accident had triggered the investigation that brought down the city's most dangerous criminal organization. The plaque honored both Maria Rodriguez's sacrifice and Emma's courage, acknowledging that justice had been achieved through the combined efforts of federal law enforcement and an individual victim who refused to be silenced. Local businesses that had been terrorized by Marco's extortion network contributed to the memorial fund, grateful for the federal investigation that had freed them from years of criminal intimidation. The systematic destruction of organized crime in Charleston had allowed legitimate commerce to flourish without the shadow of violence and corruption that had hung over the community for decades. Emma's victim advocacy work expanded beyond Charleston as federal prosecutors in other cities requested her assistance with cases involving organized crime families that had learned from Marco's mistakes and developed more sophisticated methods of avoiding detection. Her foundation became a national resource for families seeking justice against criminals who believed themselves protected by wealth and corruption. The Foundation's second major initiative was a legal assistance program that provided resources for victims who could not afford the kind of comprehensive prosecution that had destroyed Marco's organization. Emma understood that most families affected by organized crime lacked the institutional connections that had made her father's investigation possible, and she was determined to level the playing field for people seeking justice against powerful criminals. As the 6-month anniversary of her accident arrived, Emma found herself thinking about the strange sequence of events that had brought her family face to face with the truth about their shared tragedy. A moment of reckless driving had triggered a federal investigation that exposed 15 years of hidden criminal activity and delivered justice that had seemed impossible. She walked through Charleston's historic district every morning now, taking the same route that had brought her to Meeting Street on the day that changed everything. But instead of hurrying to client meetings focused on building her graphic design business, she was walking to the Foundation office where she helped other families find the strength and resources to seek justice against the criminals who had shattered their lives. The morning sun painted the antebellum buildings in the same golden light that had witnessed her accident, but Emma no longer saw Charleston as the city where she had been broken. It was the city where she had been transformed, where justice had been achieved, and where her mother's legacy lived on through work that would protect other families from the violence that had once seemed unstoppable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Michael, who was beginning his shift at the federal building where the investigation that had saved her life had been coordinated. The message was simple but carried the warmth of someone who understood both her strength and her vulnerability, someone who had witnessed her transformation from victim to advocate. The man who had tried to destroy her family was spending his first morning of the rest of his life in federal prison, while Emma was beginning another day of work that honored her mother's memory and protected other families from experiencing the pain that had once seemed insurmountable. What does justice really mean to you after everything your family has been through? She knew that viewers who had followed her story would have their own relationships with accountability and healing, their own understanding of what it meant to transform pain into purpose. Walking confidently through the intersection where her journey had begun, Emma Rodriguez carried herself with the strength of someone who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged victorious, ready to help others find their own paths from suffering to justice, from victim to advocate, from broken to unbreakable.